First of all, I want to thank you all for stopping by today and spending a few minutes together. What I thought I might do is talk a little bit about some of the administration's philosophical points of view, but then I'm going to focus on sort of what's going on Beacon Hill. The session is obviously well underway, and whenever there's a representative from the Senate President's office and a key committee chair from the House, it seems like as good an opportunity as any to talk about what I'd like to see them get done between now and July. Let me just start with a comment about sort of overall philosophy, and you mentioned a little bit of that when you spoke about the sort of collaborative approach we take to the work. I did grow up in Needham. My mom, God rest her soul, was a Democrat. My dad's a Republican, and there are friends of mine who actually wouldn't come to dinner at our house when we were kids because they knew they'd get called on and have to participate in the ongoing discussion between my mom and dad about the affairs of the day. And I learned very early on that there's many points of view on an issue, but I also learned that it's supposed to be a conversation and not a fight. And for 60 years, my parents canceled each other out in every election. But they had some really awesome conversations that my brothers and I had a chance to have a front row seat in. And I did come away believing that anybody who thinks they have the corner on every right answer is probably wrong. And you learn a lot more by listening than you do by talking. And we've tried very hard to bring that approach to governing, and I think it's part of why, if you look at who serves in senior positions in our administrations, it's a pretty decent cross-section of people from both political parties, but more importantly from walks of life and experiences, and I think that makes us a lot better than we would be otherwise, and frankly helps us ensure that we reflect a variety of points of view when we're making decisions. The Lieutenant Governor and I, Karen Polito, both also served in local government. And because we served in local government, we start with a notion that if you don't have good partnerships with your colleagues in local government and you're not helping and enabling local communities to succeed, you're not going to be very successful as a state. And whether it's the Community Compact Program, which the Lieutenant Governor chairs and offers sort of guidance, technical assistance, and funding to support best practice initiatives, which all 351 cities and towns in Massachusetts participate in, and have worked on over 800 best practices, by the way, many of which have helped communities get bond upgrades, projects done, investments that they would have had trouble making happen otherwise, focus and attention on stuff that especially a lot of our smaller communities can't find either the sort of time or the resources to put into, or the work that we did with our colleagues in the legislature on updating 50-year-old municipal legislation, which in many cases just created a lot of goo in state law that made it very hard for cities and towns to do their work. That was one of the most amazing things I ever saw, was usually if we in the State House want to get folks in local government to come to the State House for an event, we need to like give them money, okay? It makes sense. They're busy, they got other stuff to do. When we held the signing ceremony for the update of the municipal modernization legislation, which was 250 pages long and 125 sections, we had over 150 communities show up to celebrate that. And for them, it was literally like having the bands of the past kind of let go in many cases, because a lot of the requirements that they had, reporting requirements, notification requirements, that kind of stuff, they dated back to before we had computers. And they still had to do it. And a lot of it was just agony for a lot of cities and towns, especially smaller places where that kind of stuff gets in the way of the real work. It's also why several years ago we started doing a vulnerability planning exercise on a volunteer basis with cities and towns around climate change and weather. And the idea there was, as we have a higher frequency and greater severity around storms, again, cities and towns don't always have the time or the resources or the technical support and and some other money and put together a vulnerability planning exercise on a voluntary basis. We got about 100 communities to go through that process. The legislature adopted it as part of state law in the environmental bond bill that we signed last year. So everybody needs to do it, and we now have about 220 of the 351 cities and towns that have gone through this vulnerability planning exercise. And the beauty of that is once you do a vulnerability planning exercise, you then have to do a mitigation exercise and figure out what things you would choose to do to deal with whatever your particular issues around storms and climate and weather would be. And just to get a little wonky on this, the National Government Association met with the folks at FEMA when we were down there in February, and the folks at FEMA told us that they spent $80 billion on disaster recovery over the previous 2 years, which was more than they had spent in the previous 35 years. And the point they made to us was the game here with respect to climate and weather has changed. And so they're now starting to consider making funds available to states and to local communities to do the kind of vulnerability planning that we're currently paying for. And the reason they're doing it is they recognize and understand that if they don't do this work and give communities and states the ability to put in place the resiliency initiatives and the adaptation initiatives that are required to sort of prevent the kind of damage that gets done by a lot of these storms, they are just going to end up paying for the consequences of those storms on the back end. And the second thing they started talking about was the way FEMA works is they pay for cities and towns to put back exactly the way it was a storm-damaged environment. And they started talking about the fact that maybe we need to get into the business of not just putting it back the way it was, because if we do that, it will just wash away again the next time there's a big storm. Maybe we should start thinking about how to be more forward-looking on this and building into some of our reimbursement methodologies, the resiliency initiatives and the protection and the mitigation work that's going to be required to ensure that the next time one of these storms come through, it doesn't have the same consequence that it did the last time it came through. Now, if the feds are starting to head in this direction, this is actually a really good sign, I think, for all of us that people are figuring this out. I can't tell you how many places I visited in the last 4 years after a bad storm that did a ton of damage where somebody said to me, you know, I've lived here for 50 or 60 years. And 2 years ago we had, you know, the 100-year storm, and then this year we had another 100-year storm. And I said, you should hold on to that thought. And I think one of the things we're hoping to make some progress with our colleagues in the legislature on this year, I'm testifying on this issue this afternoon, which is part of the reason why I'm bringing it up, is we have a proposal to create a revolving expendable trust that would generate about $130 million a year, $1 billion, more than $1 billion over 10 years, that could be spent on resiliency, hazard mitigation, and fortification efforts in all 351 cities and towns. I don't happen to believe that cities and towns are going to have the resources on their own that are necessary to do a lot of this work. And as we get through this vulnerability planning exercise, and as people figure out what their particular issues and concerns are, the beauty about putting together an expendable trust is it's just there every year, and it automatically gets replenished, and we can work with our colleagues in local government to do the work that they're all going to need to do to deal with the fact that, you know, all those culverts you have that were installed 40 and 50 years ago that are really important probably weren't built for the kind of frequency and severity of weather that we're going to be dealing with on a go-forward basis. And when those culverts fail, you know, bad things happen. Areas get flooded out, bridges are no longer usable, roads are no longer passable. And we've ended up doing a lot of emergency repairs on a lot of these over the past few years. And I think it would be better for us to actually do the work of actually fortifying and upgrading these things so that they don't end up failing as a result of the storms that we're all going to be dealing with going forward. Again, our housing initiative. That came straight out of conversations with our colleagues in local government, and that's also currently pending before the Housing Committee. And basically, what we are trying to do is to get back into the business of doing housing production in Massachusetts. We used to build 30,000 new units of housing every single year for 50 years until the 1990s. And then that number fell to around 8,000 to 10,000 units a year. So for 30 years, we've been building less than half the new housing we used to build as a matter of clockwork every year for almost half a century. And since 2000, we've added about 500,000 people to our population without really producing anywhere near the amount of housing that we need to produce to meet that demand. And when you have scarcity like that, what happens is you don't have a lot of inventory. The inventory you have when it goes on the market gets priced out of sight because it's competitive. And that pushes people farther and farther away from where they work, where they might want to live, where they go to school, which then creates other issues for them around transportation and the like. And the bill we have pending is relatively uncomplicated. It simply moves from, it gives communities the ability through a majority vote to go to a majority vote on 9 of the key issues associated with development and housing in communities in Massachusetts, away from a 2/3 vote. And as a former member of a select board, I think a lot about the fact that we had a 5-member board. To get a 2/3 vote on a 5-member board, you got to get a 4-1, because 3-2 is not 2/3. Salem has an 11-member city council. 6-5, not enough. 7-4, not enough. They got to get to 8-3 to make something happen. If you have a 9-member board, 5-4, not enough. You got to get to 6-3. God forbid you have a 3-member board. I mean, so and there may have been a time when people were sort of building out their communities where this worked, but now we're in a situation where people have to reimagine a lot of their communities. And I'll talk primarily about downtowns, okay? The key driver in most downtowns forever in America was retail, okay? It's very hard to drive a downtown with retail in a world in which so much business in retail is being done online. So what people are thinking about now is downtown needs to be about offices, hospitality, entertainment, housing, work, live, play. And if it can be located by by public transportation, even better. That type of work with a 2/3 process through every single one of those 9 steps, no one's going to play to what I would call the mid-market on that, because the time it's going to take and the money that's going to be involved and the risks associated with getting to the end, almost by definition, means people are going to play to the upper end of the market, because that's going to be the only way they're going to get their money back. And our problem is we need to build housing that regular people can afford. And that means we need to produce it. And we spent a year and a half working with local officials, home builders, realtors, land use professionals, environmental advocates, smart growth advocates, affordable housing folks, and everybody basically said that if we want to get into the production business, we've got to do something about the current model that we have baked into state law that all communities have to comply with to build. And I'm modestly optimistic that people recognize that we now have the highest median rents in the country and the highest median housing prices in the country, and that we need to get back into the business of building housing, all kinds of housing, senior housing, affordable housing, single-family housing, young person's housing, multifamily housing, transit-oriented housing. I mean, yeah, all of it, right? Get this one through the legislature in this session, because I think it would make a really big deal, and it would make a really big difference. On the opioid and behavioral health stuff, I'll just say this: I didn't run for governor to work on this issue; it just found me, and it found me because everywhere I went, I met someone who told me a story, and the modest success that we've had in Massachusetts, and it's modest, okay, in literally taking a trend of overdoses and deaths that was just going like this, and at least flattening it out, and in the case of deaths, actually, we're one of the less than 10 states in the country have actually seen a decline in deaths in the last 2 years, and we're one of them. This is the kind of issue we didn't get into overnight, so we don't get out of it overnight. And I keep saying to people that we've passed 2 really important pieces of legislation. They've been actually blueprints for people in other states who are pursuing their own approaches to dealing with prevention, education, treatment, and recovery in this space. But this is like, this is going to be one of these things that you got to stay in the game and stay involved and stay committed to it for at least as long as it took to get here. So in my way of thinking, this is going to be like a 10-year mission at least. And the good news is the legislature has been incredibly collaborative and supportive on this stuff, and we got another really good budget with a whole bunch of additional initiatives attached that came out this year that can help us build on some of the successes we've had over the course of the past several years. The 2 other things I just want to mention, and then I'll be happy to take questions. The first is we also have, and I think this is sort of not surprising, a pretty important conversation going on what I'm calling sort of Education 2.0. I was around in the 1990s when we passed the original education reform bill in Massachusetts, and truthfully, I don't think people knew, I certainly didn't, when that law passed, whether or not it would work, okay? But the idea was you create a foundation budget, the state funds communities at a rate based on communities' ability to pay. Communities have a threshold that they have to pay up to based on their economic well-being. State fills in the gap to get to whatever the foundation budget is. And the trade-off on that was accountability standards, curriculum frameworks, a different approach to professional development. And sort of the way I think of it is the state establishes kind of the parameters, fills in the gaps on the funding, and then it's up to the locals to figure out how to achieve the objectives that are defined in the law. And when that law got passed, most people forget this, but Massachusetts was kind of a middle-of-the-pack player on the national education assessment exams. And you could just watch over the course of 20 years as Massachusetts moved up and eventually became #1 on that annual exam, and has stayed there for the past 6 or 7 years. And last year, we actually finished #1 in the country on the AP exams as well, even though we had more kids take the test than just about any other state in the country as a percent of our graduating population. And if our kids, and if Massachusetts high schoolers were country, it would have finished 2nd in the world behind Singapore on a global science exam they took. So in many ways, a lot of what was hoped to be achieved with education reform 1.0 was. The big problem we still have is, despite some of the progress that we've made in urban communities, our urban students and districts still significantly trail the performance of the schools in the suburbs. And there was a Foundation Budget Review Commission that finished a report a couple years ago that said there were 4 main funding gaps. One was around the cost of healthcare. The second was around the cost of special ed students. The third was around the cost of English language learner students, and the fourth one was around low-income students. And that those 4 elements needed to be updated and baked into the formula going forward. And we filed a bill on this in January. It was heard before the Education Committee about 3 weeks later. The legislature is clearly, trying to move this one quickly. Ours dealt with all 4 of those. There's like 4 or 5 bills kicking around, but they all, for the most part, are all working on addressing this particular issue, and I think that's good news. The 2 other things I would add to this, we started an early college program a couple years ago as a demonstration, and Framingham State, by the way, has been a giant player in this. And what's been interesting about this early college program, we weren't really sure which school districts and which community colleges, or even which kids were necessarily going to bite on this, but about half the kids are certified, qualified, low-income kids, and 3/4 of them are kids of color, and almost all of them are in cities. who really latched on to this early college program. And it gives them the ability, through a partnership usually with a state university, Framingham State or a community college, to go to school, at their school, take college courses, earn college credits, figure out if they can do college work, and almost all the kids who are doing this are kids who weren't really sure if college was for them, weren't really sure even high school was for them, and they have discovered that this program creates an applied sense of what learning is all about for them. And we just did an event with this year's graduating class, and you know, these kids have 16 credits, 21 credits, 25 credits, for which they paid nothing. And almost all of them are first generation kids going to college and are now familiar with the drill, and they understand what it's about, and the relationship it's created between a lot of these high schools and these community colleges and state universities is really powerful stuff. And we would like to see this whole early college thing just baked right into the way we do education generally, because the possibility and the opportunity here to make college real for a whole bunch of kids for whom it may not have seemed real at all is powerful. And we've done this for 3 years now. The program's going like this, and you're likely to see something in our final deficiency that will encourage the legislature to expand this, because we think this initiative, especially for first generation kids, could be incredibly powerful and important. The second thing I wanted to mention is the timing around this. It's pretty clear to me that the budget this year, wherever it ends up, and Representative Linsky mentioned the fact that they're going to work real hard to get me one before the end of June. We put in a pretty good number based on the idea of trying to fund those 4 key ingredients more along the term lines of the Foundation Budget Review Commission report. House and Senate did the same thing. I think this coming fiscal year is going to be a pretty good year for a lot of the schools and school districts that think we needed to do more on their behalf, kind of no matter what comes out of the process. And then the second piece of this will probably be a piece of legislation that I'm guessing will certainly happen by the end of the session. How much sooner than that? I'm looking at the House and the Senate over there. I'm not sure. But this is one where when people have asked me about it, my answer has been people want to get this done. This is something people really want to see happen this year, and I anticipate that it will. And then the final thing I just want to mention is we proposed a 5-year capital plan for both roads and bridges and public transportation yesterday, which is $8 billion. It's the largest spend on public transportation in any 5-year history in the history of the Commonwealth. And a $10 billion 5-year plan for roads and bridges, which outside of the Big Dig is also the biggest 5-year proposal ever. And they will both be framed through a bond bill, transportation bond bill, that we'll be filing with the legislature sometime in the next few weeks. Maybe, it might be a month, but it'll be shortly. And it's our hope and anticipation that that legislation, as those bond bills usually do, will work its way through the process and get done sometime probably Q1 or Q2 of next year. But the bottom line is our goal is to spend a very big sum on a whole series of way overdue investments in roads, bridges, and our public transportation system. And I am fond of saying that many of the elements on the public transportation system in particular are older than my dad, and he's 91. It's just time. I mean, a lot of the stuff I wish had been done before. It didn't get done, but it's going to get done. And I do think it will dramatically improve the quality of the system's performance overall. Although I do want to say that, you know, in fairness to the people who work for the MBTA, if you look at the on-time performance metrics across most of the system, they have gotten gradually better every year since 2015. We have light years to go in terms of capacity and a whole bunch of other things, but I do believe the progress there has been important because it makes a statement about why this $8 billion could really take this thing to the next level once it gets deployed and executed across the system. On the final thing I get asked to talk a little bit about is just the relationship we have with our colleagues in government. I don't think most people get measured in public life, and I say this as a former local official and a former appointed state official and now as an elected official. We don't get measured by what happens on the 6 o'clock news, okay? We really don't. We get measured by how people feel about how things are going in their community over time. That's how we get measured. And that's a function of the work that we do to build strong communities. And if people feel their community, their region is doing well, if they feel like their schools are doing well, if their parks are clean and well maintained, if they see progress economically. In this region, I was talking to the mayor, you have one of the lowest unemployment rates in the Commonwealth in this region, and they see positive developments and people working together and doing the things that they care about, that's how you get measured. And you know, this is work, it's not entertainment. If you want entertainment, you can always watch Netflix. That's been the way we've approached this thing from the beginning, and I don't get the whole idea that the game, that for me to win, you have to lose, all right? I think that is like nuts. I mean, to me, the way you win is everybody wins and everybody feels like things are moving in the right direction and feels good about their hopes and their possibilities and their opportunities for themselves and their families. That's how you win. It's not a win-lose, because we all have to win together. Thank you.
Thank you, Governor Baker. We have time for a few questions and answers, and in the interest of time, we solicited questions ahead from a sampling of members, and they're going to be asked by 3 of our board members who represent our greater membership. And I'd like to ask those members to come up. Helen Lemoyne is the Executive Director of Leadership MetroWest. She's the Vice Chair on the Chamber for Nonprofits, Education, and Municipal Members. Craig Liesot from MathWorks is Vice Chair for Membership for Large Businesses, and Bing Yao from AFC Urgent Care is Vice Chair for Membership for Small Businesses. So we'll start with Helen's question.
Thank you, Kathy, and thank you, Governor Baker, for being here. First question is, it is recognized that a life sciences hub is emerging in the MetroWest to Worcester corridor. What can the Commonwealth do to attract and retain businesses from startups and entrepreneurs to established life science companies that are outside of Boston and Cambridge?
So, first of all, you're right. There is a growing, burgeoning life science cluster out here. It goes from here all the way out to Marlborough. And there are a lot of really interesting companies that are part of it. The best way we can do it is, or to support it, is through the Life Science Center, which you know something about, which was created about almost 10 years ago and was just reauthorized by the legislature at the end of the last session. And the Life Science Center basically does 3 things, okay? They invest in infrastructure, educational infrastructure, and that educational infrastructure is at the high school, voc tech school, community college, and university level. And it has been very effective at helping the Commonwealth's educational community do a better job of preparing kids and young adults for careers and opportunities in the life science space. The second is finding opportunities to partner with, again, our colleagues in local government around either expansions or locations that are associated with life sciences. And we have done dozens of shared public-private partnerships around either expansions or builds or retrofits of existing companies or new companies And almost all of that work has been outside of what we think of as the core area of life science, Cambridge, the whole greater Boston thing. It's all been sort of 128, 495, and beyond, okay? And that's deliberate on our part. Our view on this stuff is there are lots of opportunities for us to work with our colleagues in local government and in industry to use the resources at the Life Science Center to ensure that manufacturing jobs, research and development opportunities, acquisitions are things that can be done here in the Commonwealth and can continue to grow businesses and grow economies here. And if you go to almost any community that's sort of 128 to 495 and beyond that has a big life science footprint, I promise you at some point in the past 5-10 years, there was some sort of an arrangement project that was done between the local community, the Life Science Center, and that company to sort of strengthen the foothold that that company has and the employment base that that company has in that community. We do this stuff all the time, and it's really important.
So the question I'm reading is about workforce. The Workforce Task Force for Greater Boston, which includes MetroWest, has identified health occupations, computer and IT occupations, as having the greatest current and future workforce gaps. What can the Commonwealth be doing to diminish those gaps?
So first of all, I'm hoping that MathWorks is going to be a big player in STEM in October, okay? We did a STEM week last year. We have a STEM council. It's co-chaired by Jeff Leiden from Vertex, Lieutenant Governor Karen Polito, and Congressman Joe Kennedy. And it has been building a whole series of initiatives around STEM that involve internships and after-school activities and academic enrichment. And one of the big initiatives we started last year was to have a week that was just dedicated to STEM. We had 500 events at every level, literally from like grade school all the way up to collegiate level around STEM, usually involving companies in the space and educational institutions. And our goal this year is to have at least 100. We think we can get to 200 communities involved in this and 1,000 events. And to continue to promote the notion that STEM plays in every space. It plays in every space. And one of the things about this, about these initiatives, particularly around the internship program, is kids learn that STEM really does play almost everywhere. There are very few companies, there are very few businesses, nonprofits, healthcare organizations, you name it. STEM is part of the game for pretty much everybody. And on the healthcare piece, there's a very robust committee that's currently working on a series of educational and skill building programs that are tied directly to where the biggest job opportunities are going to be in healthcare going forward. And it's got educators and healthcare organizations in it. It's chaired by Roz Acosta, who's the Secretary for Labor and Workforce Development. And I think it's going to produce a terrific set of credit-based programs that are going to be offered by schools that we know have jobs on the other end of them if people find their way into them and do them.
Thank you very much, Governor Baker. I'm being told by the governor's staff that he really needs to leave, so we're not going to get to the third question.
Well, what was the third question?
The third question was, Governor, that given the fact that you were the most popular governor in the country, we're wondering if you one day would run for the higher office. Yeah. And finally, fix the big problem that we have with how divisive our country has been and be in position to fix the problem.
So, Boston Mayor Marty Walsh and I went down to Washington a couple of weeks ago to talk to people in the House and in the Senate and the executive branch about transportation and infrastructure. And we thought, Democrat mayor, Republican governor, if we went down and did this together, the message we would try to send to a lot of these folks is that getting together and finding a way to work together on this stuff would be really good. And, the funny thing is, we met with people on the House side and the Senate side, Republicans and Democrats, key committees, and we also met with the Massachusetts congressional delegation, and we met with people in the White House. And everybody basically said, yeah, we really need to do an infrastructure bill. I actually think, I came back actually kind of optimistic about it, and then the whole thing kind of fell apart. And I think, you know, one of the things that makes a negotiation work or a collaboration is a recognition and appreciation that you have to give to get in these things, and I just don't think those guys and gals think enough about this stuff that way, and particularly on something like infrastructure. If they spend any time at all talking to almost anybody, I think they just, you know, sort of outside their own circle, they find out how important that would be for people that it get done. And it's my hope that that they do. But I continue to believe that the best part about state and local government is there's like no place to hide, and that lack of places and spaces to hide almost forces you, by definition, into recognizing and understand that you're going to be judged not on what you're against, but what you achieve. And I, you know, I really wish the Fed level worked a little more like that, because I think it would work better.